this is Mumbai. Look at this auditorium. There's not a free seat. Pico, this is very important. There are lines outside. You have a fan club, like amazing fan club here, as you could tell from the applause. I'm your fangirl. I have been researching you for the last, I don't know how many days. I have copious notes, which I will be referring to in my higgledy-piggledy handwriting. But welcome to Mumbai.
Thank you. I think they're here for you as much as for me, or more so. But I'm so excited to see you again. Do you remember the last time we met?
Tell me.
You remember, though.
You're the one with the memory.
Yeah, well, I remember the dates. 1996, I arrive in Mumbai, first time in years, to write an article on it. And I've been instructed there's only one way to write an article, which is suddenly to invite Shobhaa to lunch. And you take me to what was then a very little-known fish restaurant called Trishna, and then I've been dining out on it the last 28 years, so memorable.
Well, everything about your life is memorable, but I am not going to waste the time of our eager readers and audiences here by talking about something they can access on Google. So I'm not going to list out your books. I'm not going to list out your multiple achievements. All I'm going to say is, first of all, thank you very much, Amy, Kwasar, and most particularly the volunteers of this festival, because without this team, all of us wouldn't be here today celebrating it as we have done over the years. I feel like part of the family, having been a part of it, the festival for as long as I have. So a big round of applause for just the amazing team. Just amazing. And it also shows what a lot of people don't perhaps associate with Bombay is the love the city has for ideas, for words, for writers, for creative people. And that's why they're here in such large numbers. So thank you, audience, for being here. And this is going to be a conversation. It's going to be a back and forth, like we were discussing backstage. And all of you are going to be eavesdroppers. His words. So I want to ask you, Pico, about your name to start with, your parents, Nandini particularly, your mother, a South Mumbai girl, pretty much who grew up around here, your father, a philosopher, Nandini, a Gujarati lady, who you lost at, she was 91?
90, but yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the name, it was Siddhartha Pico. Can you give us a background to that name? Because it's very unusual, and only unusual parents would think of combining. Tell us about your name.
Yes, so both my parents were philosophers, yes. And I was born in England. As you say, both my parents grew up entirely in Bombay, went to Elphinstone College. My mother was here on Marine Drive, and actually I came here in part to scatter her ashes next to the gateway, which she'd requested yesterday. So they were both philosophers, and knowing that, and they were professors of comparative religions also, so they were steeped in all the religious traditions of the world. So they wanted to name me after the Buddha, so hence Siddharth. But they also knew, since I was growing up in England in the 1950s, Siddharth would instantly become Sid, or something much worse. And so they gave me the second name after a Renaissance heretic philosopher, Pico della Mirandola, which has actually served me really well, because it's a global name. Anyone in the world can assume it belongs to Spain or Portugal or wherever. Easy to spell, easy to pronounce. And then, as you know, my third name is my father's name, Raghavan. And Iyer. So between my four names, I've actually got four religious traditions. The Buddha, a Catholic heretic. My father was a theosophist, and then Iyer is a good Hindu name. So they really were preparing me for the global world, I think.
But in so many ways, I have to say that I'm feeling a little left out of your passion for the cities that you've named in a tweet, which I shall read out, wickedly, of course. Because it's a recent tweet.
In fact, you're the first person ever to have read my tweet, so this is a historic moment for me.
So much for my meticulous homework. His recent tweet says, "Some cities transform, some soothe, some enchant, but what we crave are the ones, and you name them, New York, Hong Kong, Bangkok, Havana, that make us feel alive. But Mumbai is conspicuously missing from your list.
I will tell you why. Because I wrote that at 4 o'clock this morning while enjoying a tasty breakfast next door. And the only reason I didn't mention Mumbai was I tweeted something yesterday about Mumbai. And the fact that I was eating a mushroom risotto at 3:15 in the morning in the Trident Hotel.
Saw that.
You saw
Yes,
that
I
too.
saw that.
So, but actually, it was Mumbai that made me think of the idea of which cities really make you feel alive. And one thing I've noticed in the US is that people from around the world come to New York City, and the only ones who hit the ground running and pretty much take over the city within hours are the people from Mumbai, because New York is just a poor person's Mumbai. So I think no city prepares people as well for New York City as Mumbai.
A Flame, I have to tell you that this is a world premiere for Pico's new book. It's called A Flame, and it chronicles all his stays at the Benedictine monasteries for over a long period. So do you want to just tell us about, because it's very exciting for us to know that you're announcing this book at our Lit Fest.
Yes, I'd be honored. This is, the first time I've ever mentioned it in public. Just before I do, on the subject of tweets, I should say, you probably know this, because you're the queen of social media and every media. I'm in the 13th century moving backwards, essentially. So I've never used a cell phone. I've never seen a tweet. But 12 years ago, I was working with a company, and they felt so sorry for me that I was so out of touch. They said, you've got to start tweeting. And I didn't know what to do, because I'd never seen one. So every day for the last 12 years, I've put up one sentence. But I don't know how to answer a tweet. I don't know how to read a tweet. And I barely know how to post a tweet. So that's what...
You know, it doesn't matter, because your followers are there for the lines that you're putting up every day, because those happen to be so very inspiring.
My follower. I think you're the only one, but...
No, I'll tell you, you have 22.2 thousand followers on Twitter.
Okay. That's the Iyer family, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you for asking about A Flame, because you're right, it's very close to my heart. And for 33 and a half years now, I've been going every few months to this Benedictine monastery on the coast of California overlooking the Pacific Ocean. And one thing that touches me about it is, of course, it's a group of very devout Catholics, and I'm not a Christian. And yet they so open their hearts and their doors to me, and they've opened their whole tradition to me, which otherwise I wouldn't have known about. So I've reached a stage in life when I want to write about what I care about most, and that's been my secret home for more than half my lifetime. And so finally, because I've stayed there so long, and I used to stay 3 weeks at a time, I often stay with the monks in their cloister, so I've accumulated, you know this as a writer, maybe 4,000 pages of notes, and then trying to compress it into almost a haiku-like book was an incredible struggle, but the joy of it was every morning when I woke up in our little apartment in Japan, I would close my eyes and I would be sitting above the Pacific Ocean in California, hearing the bell toll and looking out over that grand horizon. And so there was nothing more inspiring to find at my desk every day.
Two questions leading up to from what you just said. Haiku, is it unique only to Japan? Have you encountered haikus in any form, in any other language or culture? And have you attempted a haiku yourself? And for those who may not know what a haiku is, if you could just please take us through what a haiku actually means. Because it needs the other person to complete the haiku, right? The person who's...
Yes.
Yes?
Perfectly said, exactly. For those of you who don't know it, it's a poem of just 3 lines, 17 syllables, and it nearly always has to do with the seasons, and it's deeply personal, but there's no personality. And as you said it perfectly, it's just a whisper that's inviting the reader to bring it into her life and to complete the sentence. It's like an invitation to a dialogue rather than a statement. And it's a suggestion and an opening rather than a completion. And so it's prophetic and telepathic, you ask that, because I just started writing haiku in the last couple of years. I don't know if I'll ever publish any. But it's a wonderful form. And I remember, for example, as soon as I arrived in Japan, so 37 years ago, I read a poem by a man called Issa, who was a man who saw, he lost one child after another, his house burnt down, his life was nothing but tragedy, and all his poems speak for gratitude and celebration. And he realized impermanence was the law of the world and decided to celebrate every moment because you can't count on the next moment. But his famous haiku, which in translation was when his little daughter suddenly died, he wrote, "This world of dew is a world of dew, and yet." In other words, we all know that none of us lasts, we all know we can't count on anything, and yet still it breaks the heart. And I think haiku has that quality, as you know, because it's so short, it goes right through you like a dagger. And if there were more words, the impact would be really diluted. But having it just like a breath really goes through you.
You just mentioned the person, Isa, who's written that incredible haiku after experiencing immense and deep loss. You experienced something pretty similar yourself when your family home got burnt down in California in a wildfire. And you lost just about everything that had any meaning in your life at that point. And then you quote the Dalai Lama, who tells you what suffering can teach you, what loss and suffering can actually teach you. So do you want to just recount that period in your life, because you were dealing with much more than just a wildfire?
Yes, that's such a beautiful question. Thank you. So I will say, and you, I think, know this already. So there I was in my family home in California. I saw this distant knife of orange cutting through a hillside. So I called the fire department. And when I came upstairs again, it was to find that our whole house was surrounded by flames 30 meters high. And I was stuck in the middle of the fire for 3 hours. And as you say, I lost everything in the world. And you know this as a fellow journalist. I was stuck there, and at one point I was stuck right under my house. And I saw the flames systematically making their way through the living room, reducing all my notes, which were handwritten, to ash, wiping out every last memento and photograph and teddy bear and keepsake I'd ever collected. And then I drove down and to sleep on a friend's floor, and I was sleeping on that floor for many months to come. But the one compensation was my job at that time, it's just before I met you, was to be an essayist for Time magazine. And the good thing about being a journalist is the worse the experience you go through, the better the story that comes out of it. And I just had an eyewitness account on what was then the worst fire in Californian history. So as soon as I got to my friend's house, I asked if I could use the computer, and I wrote an article then and there. And actually, I ended it with a haiku, because I'd already been spending a few years in Japan. A famous haiku from the 17th century, somebody called Masahide, who said, "My house burnt down, I can now see better the rising moon." And so even, yeah, exactly. I mean, the real wisdom of Japan and the world. And in retrospect, I'm so startled that when I was in my early 30s, I'd been through this calamity, but something in me, wiser than I am, intuited it wasn't entirely bad. And actually many good things came out of that. I moved to Japan, I wrote a novel which I'd have been too scared to do otherwise. I could live much more simply without all the things that I'd accumulated. So even the night of the fire, I realized I couldn't say it's a bad event, and nor could I say it's a good event. I couldn't say it's any event except part of life. And then, as you say, with the Dalai Lama, I'd already been spending time with him. I first went to visit him in Dharamsala in 1974 when I was a teenager, because my father had met him in 1960 as soon as he came into India. And when I think about it, I hadn't really thought about it till you just asked, he's probably suffered more than anybody I know. He's been cut off from his homeland for 65 years. He's seen 13 of his siblings die. He's called a demon in wolf's clothing by the government of the largest nation on earth almost, or second largest nation now. And yet all he does is radiate joy and confidence and that infectious smile. So it's a good reminder. I think one of the first lessons I learned, again, when I arrived in Japan, it's maybe a Buddhist saying, but they say in Japan, life is about joyful participation in a world of sorrows. So from the Buddhist point of view, all of us, well, most of us will know long life. Nearly all of us will know sickness. All of us will know death. But none of that is incompatible with beauty and joy and hope. But I mean, your writing is so much about fun and delight and affirmation and all of that in the middle of a life that's often difficult. So I was very glad to learn from Japan that the fact of difficulty doesn't preclude the fact of delight in some ways. And I think the Dalai Lama is the living incarnation of that, and of course become one of India's great treasures.
India's great treasures. Thank you for saying that.
Oh, well, now, maybe can I embarrass you? Are you embarrassable? I don't know.
Not at all. Nothing embarrasses me in the world. So, no, I'm so glad you said it, and so flatly. Because he is our treasure.
Yeah, he is our treasure. And the way I'll embarrass you is just saying, as soon as I arrived in Mumbai, I arrived about midnight a day and a half ago. And as soon as I woke up at dawn with 2 cousins, I made a pilgrimage to the Taj Hotel, where I'd actually had my honeymoon 25 years ago, almost to the day. And as soon as I arrived, I saw 2 things. I was so happy I walked into the wonderful Nalanda bookshop, and the first thing that greeted me was a picture of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. And then I walked along the corridor where they show the greatest dignitaries in history who have stayed there, Bill Clinton and Nelson Mandela and whoever, and there was a regal picture of Miss Shobhaa. So you were greeting me as soon as I arrived.
I hope they never take it off. I always pass by and take a sneak peek, and I say, oh, thank God I'm still there. So
it's the biggest picture in the gallery,
yeah,
I think.
It's a very iconic picture, but it was 100 years ago. And I don't know that I deserve to be with all the greats, but it's a great honor, and I value it. To get back to Japan, after so many years, you're married to a wonderful Japanese lady. You have a grandchild, you have 2 kids, and you still feel like an outsider. And your sort of oblique comment is that you prefer it that way in a way, even in the village where you live, outside Nara. There are kids who run around who refer to you as a parasite.
Exactly.
So tell us about your days in Japan, when you're there, when you're writing, and you in your commitment to all things Japanese, the beauty, the cuisine, all of it, and yet you have chosen to be to keep your distance. Let's put it that way.
Yes.
You haven't embraced it in totality. Your passport is not Japanese. You still spend half your time between Japan and California. So who do you actually feel from within? Just yourself?
Yes, what a lovely question. So I'll start with the parasite part.
Yes, the parasite.
Which is that everybody in this theater knows that most Japanese men especially wake up at 6 in the morning, put on the suit and tie, go to the bus stop and go to the office. I, as a writer, am slouching around in my pajamas at noon. And even worse, for many years, my wife was going out to work. So as far as the neighborhood kids were concerned, I was a slouch and a parasite, and the only male or person in the whole neighborhood who wasn't working. But you're absolutely right. So I've chosen to live on a tourist visa for 37 years there, to remind myself, as you said, I'll never be Japanese. I would never be incorporated into the community. My neighbors are probably a little unsettled that there's this funny-looking Indian guy down the street. But deep down, I feel entirely Japanese. And the reason that I moved there is this sense of affinity. I first went to Japan on a 20-hour layover between Hong Kong and New York, and I didn't want to have a layover at Tokyo Airport, but I was stuck there. I walked around the airport town, and I felt, I know this place, and it knows me. And if I don't come back here, I'll be in exile all my life. And I was right to follow that intuition, so I left my job in New York City and moved there, just to a single room in the eastern hills of Kyoto. And so, at some mysterious level, I feel it's my home. But I know that on an official level, it will never be, and the community will never want to see me as one of them, and nor should they be. So I wanted to keep myself honest, and I speak very limited Japanese. I speak Japanese like a 2-year-old girl, even though I've been there for such a long time. But the one thing I do know, as you say, is because I've had my Japanese wife, we've known each other 37 years, my 2 Japanese stepchildren, and now my Japanese granddaughter, I do know a little bit about what it is to be in a Japanese family and community and neighborhood, but you're right, I'll always be an outsider. As they say in Japan, a gaijin, which literally means outsider person.
Does that bother you that Japan can be so completely inward-looking and so resistant to anyone from the outside? Like yourself, you've been there for 37 years. You fell in love with a Japanese lady.
Yes.
You wrote a book about her.
Yes.
That's very romantic.
Very.
Can you just tell us about that? The book, how you wrote it, how you met her, what did you feel when you saw her, everything.
That's more or less a lifetime there. But Thank you. So I'll start with that and then go to the first part of your question. So you probably know this, but maybe not everybody does. So I was working in Midtown Manhattan for Time magazine, the exciting job of my dreams, with a nice apartment on Park Avenue, 25th floor office in Midtown, stimulating colleagues, chance to travel around the world. And I threw it all over in order to follow that intuition to go to Japan. And I moved to a little temple in Kyoto. And I thought whatever happened or didn't happen there would be the perfect complement to my fast-paced, exciting life in New York City. And my plan was, and I actually made a contract with a publisher to write a book about a year in a Japanese temple. And my third week in the temple, I went into another temple. I sat down, there was a Japanese woman next to me, and she became my wife. And so my contemplative year of looking at the full moon and writing haiku in the temple became actually a year of getting to know my wife and seeing her transform her life dramatically in the course of that year, just the way Japan transformed itself after World War II. So yes, you're right. After that year, which was 36 years ago, I wrote a book called The Lady and the Monk. And for better or worse, it's still, I think, the book that seems to touch people. I hear more about that book than the 15 books that have come subsequently. So there was something about it, because I think it's, you know this from your own writing, it was spoke for my sudden discovery of the culture, the lifestyle, and the person whom I hope will be mine forever. So it was suddenly a door opened, and I fell into the life that was waiting for me and should have been mine altogether. In terms of being unsettled by, you're right, Japan is such a homogeneous culture. But that's what also makes it work so efficiently, because it's as if it's a symphony orchestra, and everybody is working from the same score, and each person plays her part perfectly, and the result is this wonderful harmony, unmatched in the rest of the world. I remember in the 1990s, when I first met you, or the only time I've met you before tonight, every time I flew back into Japan, they'd strip search me at the customs. Wow. I looked exactly like what they didn't want to see coming to the country. They thought maybe I was Saddam Hussein's cousin, or maybe I was from Iran because I had a big problem with illegal immigration from Iran. Or then they thought maybe he's actually just an Indian who travels a lot, and we don't know what to do with that in our circular kind of family-like society. So it was always difficult to get through customs. But as soon as I got through customs, everyone was as kind and gracious as possible. And I couldn't complain about this, because that sense of unity and harmony that stitches Japan together is precisely what makes it such a peaceful, conflict-avoidant, melodious society. And so everything I love about Japan comes from the fact that everyone is working from the same assumptions. As long as I remember that I'm working from different assumptions and don't try to push my way into a society that doesn't necessarily want me as one of its own.
You have a memory that's scary for most people. There's nothing that you forget, but you also take copious notes. You make notes of every person you've ever met, the dates, what you felt, what you saw, what you observed, the journey. Every single thing is noted meticulously by you,
Yes.
handwritten
Yes.
on A4 sheets.
Yes.
Now, there must be, I don't know, like closets full of A4 sheets over the years, because you've been doing that for the longest time.
Yes.
And it's a great way for a writer to chronicle what they feel and see and observe. But how do you know what to tap into when you need it as a writer? Suddenly something comes to you, and then how do you look for it?
Such a good question, and you're right, because in fact I don't have a good memory, but it's all in here. This is what I have instead of a memory, which is I scribble down everything at the time, just as you say. And then I think when I began writing, let's say I was in Mumbai for 2 weeks and I was writing an article about Mumbai, I would go back to Japan and I would have indeed 40 pages of handwritten notes, and I would work very closely for my notes and try to give a sort of documentary of my trip to Mumbai and my lunch at Trishna. Now, if I were writing about Mumbai, I would go back to my desk and I would wait for 2 months, and I'd keep the notes on the other side of the room and I wouldn't use them. And I'd wait to see after 2 months what really moved me in Mumbai, what touched and surprised me, what moved me to change my life. What was the deepest memory and emotion I had? And I'd follow that. And then, if I needed to know whether you were wearing a pink sari or a gold sari, or whether that sign was red or blue, then I could turn to my notes to just make it precise. But I'd be working from memory and imagination. And actually, that came out of my house burning down, because I'd been spending a lot of time in Cuba, and I had 800 pages of notes for quite a moving story about a Cuban I met who finally realized his dream of coming to America. And then the day after the fire, the book was gone because all my handwritten notes were gone. And I remember ringing up my kind editor in London and saying, by the way, all the books I promised I won't be able to deliver. And because he was kind, he commiserated. But because he was wise, he said, you know, that may be the best thing that could happen to you as a writer, because you're one kind of person if you're writing from notes, and you're a very different, deeper person if you're writing with your eyes closed from memory or heart or imagination. And he knew that the absence of notes might liberate me to write more deeply. So this gives me a chance to ask you a question, which is, what's your process? Do you take a lot of notes, or do you work entirely from your imagination?
I journal. I've been journaling since I was 14 years old, but I don't always refer to it. But it's there. I mean, if anyone is interested enough, no one is, not my children, not my family. I am interested in it for my own self. It's like a discipline. And I do write 1,200 words to between 1,200 and 1,500 words a day, every single day, in some form or the other, which is nothing, Pico, compared to, my God, I mean, when I think of your staggering and prolific output, you were doing 100 articles a year till quite recently, apart from your books and apart from your TED Talks with 10 million views, and apart from your travel, which I feel they sometimes mistakenly refer to you as a travel writer, but you're so much more than a travel writer. You're a philosopher, you write travel literature, it's not travel pieces. So, I mean, we all have our methods, and I think all writers have individual methods. This works for me because I know every morning, regardless of how many glasses of wine or Negronis I might have had the previous evening, when I get to my desk, which is actually our dining table, I am in that zone, and I have to write those words because otherwise it pains me, and I can't live the rest of the day. I feel a overwhelming sense of guilt, God knows why, but till I write, I'm not happy. So happiness for me is writing in many ways.
I think that's one of the ways in which we're very similar, like brother and sister, because I think we have that same impulse that I feel something is missing from my day if I don't write, and I have to get a certain number of words out of my system. I mean, you've been raising children and doing many other things at the same time too. The reason that I was writing so many articles is a simple one that you probably understand, which is very hard for a writer to make a living, especially in a writing-unfriendly economy. I mean, I love coming to India because there's such a hunger for ideas and books and literature festivals like this. But on the other side of the world, books are almost an endangered species, and so I have to scramble around to find ways to support the writing of books that I love. But I think you and I are very, very similar, because I have to write every day, and quite a lot comes out of me every day. And then there's the challenge of how do I make it interesting and appealing to a reader and package it to send out into the world.
You said somewhere that books are best friends, that you can't have a better friend than a book. And that's something so wonderful to hear at a Lit Fest. Yeah. But let me take you back to your first book, which I'm sure a lot of us have read and enjoyed because it's acquired a kind of cult status, Video Night in Kathmandu. At the time, you were writing travel pieces very differently. And this was very journalistic, the book. Yes. It was your impressions of the places you were traveling, and you were traveling so much. I'm sure a lot of people in the audience would like to know that book and its genesis in some way.
Well, thank you. Yes, I mean, so I was in my mid-20s, and it was actually while I was living in Time magazine, or living in Time magazine, there's a misstatement, working at Time magazine, ostensibly. So I'd just been at graduate school, and I suddenly fell into this wonderful job writing on world affairs for Time magazine. But I would sit in this office in Midtown Manhattan and write about places I'd never seen. And the one beauty of Time magazine in those days, you remember in the 1980s, was a golden age for magazines. I mean, you were starting magazines and I was working in one, and Time magazine was much too generous. So although I was a kid of 25 who just arrived in the magazine, they gave me longer and longer holidays, and I started taking them in Thailand and Burma and Indonesia, and that's when I had the layover in Japan. And so quickly I saw, well, taking these holidays in wonderful places is much more exciting than sitting in a cubicle in New York and writing about places I've never seen. So I started writing pieces on my holidays to escape the office and to work my way out of a midtown office in Manhattan into a life of freedom. And so my third year at Time, I took a 6-month leave of absence, and I spent 3 months, as you said, moving very quickly across 10 countries in Asia, including, spent about 3 weeks in Mumbai writing a book about Bollywood, or writing a chapter about Bollywood. And then I went back to California and I wrote this long book in 3 months. And so when I ended my leave of absence and went back to the office, I said, as my editors probably guessed, oh, well, now I'm going to take myself off and just travel the world. And because Time magazine was doing very well in 1986, they said, well, when you go off to live in a temple in Kyoto, would you mind terribly if we sent you a check every month? And you could occasionally write essays from the monastery, because that'll give us a very different perspective than the one we're getting from Wall Street and Washington. So I really have their generosity to thank, first for giving me the holidays that allowed me to write that book when I was in my mid-20s, and then for giving me the freedom to escape entirely. So I had a little session this morning, and right after it, somebody came up to me who's a lawyer, and he said, well, I want to be a writer. How can I do exactly what you did? And I said, not very helpfully, take a time machine 40 years back, because it was relatively easy in the 1980s. Books were the center of the world, or a center of the world. Magazines were flourishing. There was a big audience for books like my first book. I think much, much harder now. So I think it was just fortunate timing that, and there was an interest then because, hard to imagine now, there's no internet, no smartphones. So when I went to Tibet in 1985, very few people I knew could even imagine what the place was like. And as a writer, I could gather sights and sounds and smells and bring them back to people who wouldn't have the chance to see Tibet. Whereas now, anyone here this evening can see almost everywhere in the world online. Mm-hmm. And a writer's job is much harder because we're competing, you must find this too, with multimedia and all these more exciting seeming forms. I mean, has your writing changed as the online world has begun to consume us?
No, I've made my peace with AI and all else, and every evil conceivable, because I've just decided I have to get into bed with this new everything, the new technology, or else, you're out of job, you're out of business. Yeah. So you have to learn to live compatibly with whatever you see around you. Yeah. And I try my best, but it doesn't actually scare me at all. I feel quite at home in this strange place. And I quite enjoy it because one gets so much energy from the young. And which is why I wanted to ask you that in such an environment, like the young person who asked you about how does one write?
Yes.
I was just thinking to myself that yesterday when we walked into the Litfest dinner, and of course, first thing I asked is, where's Pico? So I was told, he is resting. He said, I'm resting. And I thought to myself, just those two words, if you were to use them to start an essay, would mean so much more that I'm jet-lagged. I'm resting. And right after that, we got into the elevator, and there was a young man and an older person who was saying to the young man that, why don't you leave your bags in my room, and then we go to the cemetery. Now, that could be the opening line of one of your books, because I was researching you, and I know that you listen to everything, and everything interests you. And I think all of us who are in this business, we are voyeurs. We are always looking for a story, some kind of a hook. I know that I have started books based on the sight of a person walking into a room or a conversation that I've eavesdropped, and we cannibalize the lives shamelessly of everyone around us. Yes. You do that too, right?
Oh, yes.
We are both very guilty.
I pity my friends, yes. Yeah. And it's interesting, I do spend a lot of time in cemeteries, actually, to keep myself honest and to remind myself to cherish the moment and to be face-to-face with reality.
The young people, I often get asked this question myself, and I'm stumped to give them a response, because honestly, where does a writer's inspiration come from? It's like asking M.F. Hussain, why did you draw a horse and not a cow? I don't think can be explained and should not be. But everyone wants to deconstruct and make it something extremely mystical, the writing process. Whereas actually it's just slog. It's observation and slog. You put one word after another word, it makes a sentence, and then the sentence becomes a paragraph, and then the paragraph becomes a page, and finally, oh my God, it becomes a book. You said something very, very interesting about the writing process, about writing a book or writing. You said it's not important where you start, but when to stop. When do you know when to stop when you're writing?
It's very hard, but I think I often have the end in mind before the beginning in some ways. And some people here may have read the books of Kazuo Ishiguro, the great Nobel Prize winning novelist. And one thing he does cleverly is he puts all his attention on the final scene, because he knows that if it's very, very moving, that's what the reader will take away forever. And even if her attention is flagged on page 200 or 220, if something pierces the heart at the very end, it'll stay with that person forever. And I think psychologists have found that, for example, if you take a 3-week trip and 20 days are hell, and the last day is glorious, you'll remember it as a glorious trip. In other words, the end of any experience is disproportionately important for memory. And so I think thinking about the end of a book is always a good thing, or the end of a story. I so agree with you what you said about inspiration, because as you were talking, I was thinking writing is just industry, just as you say, working. But I was also thinking the inspiration comes not beforehand, but while you're at your dinner table writing your 1200s, when you're lost in the process, that's when things suddenly come out of you and to you that you didn't think you have inside you, and that's when the excitement comes. But you have to start, I mean, you and I know, because we've been doing this half a century each, that you just take yourself to the desk day after day after day, and who knows what's going to come to you. But that's the excitement and the adventure of it, which is why I wouldn't want to do anything else.
Me too. It's the uncertainty is what keeps us going, I think. You
Yes.
just don't know. You just don't know.
It's the biggest
and I love
adventure
that.
around, yes. And I really appreciated what you said about I'm resting, or I'm taking a break, or I'm catching my breath, because a few years ago, the people who run the TED Talks noticed that everyone's out of breath, and we can't catch up with ourselves, and we're living at a post-human rate, at the speed of light instead of the speed of life. And so they asked me, please, will you write a book about stillness, about slowing down, stepping away from the world, and catching your breath. And then my book, A Flame, that's about to come out, that you kindly mentioned, is almost explicitly in response to the fact that I feel that so many of us are caught up in this rush of distraction and acceleration, and we know it's not making us satisfied, but we don't know how to stop. And that's why you almost have to do something radical to get away from your cell phone, to get away from the traffic and the clatter of the everyday, and suddenly remember what you care about. But at that level, we all need to rest. And of course, when the Dalai Lama's talking, he always stresses the most important meditation of his day is sleeping. He's seen that he goes to sleep quite early and sleeps a lot, because everything depends on how well you've rested. And if you're not rested, you can't really do justice to anyone or anything, I feel.
Do you get enough rest?
I sleep a lot. That's probably another reason they call me the parasite. It's sacrosanct.
I envy that so much. I think we're being told to cut our conversation, which is such a shame. Amy, you should have given us at least 2 hours.
2 days.
2 days, says Pico. Because also somewhere you said that writing is what you do. You shouldn't be thinking when you're...
Yeah. Yes,
right? When
yes,
you're writing happens when you're not thinking.
Yes. And it took me a long time, I don't know if you have an equivalent, to realize my best writing comes when I'm taking a walk. So an important part of my writing practice is during my hours at my desk, I take a walk around the neighborhood, pretty much the same walk every day. But that's when I'm not hostage to my notes, and all kinds of things can come to me. I mean, do you do something that allows you to think outside the box in that way?
Shower.
Yeah? Yes? Exactly.
The best ideas. It's the only time I'm alone,
yes,
technically.
Yes. In fact,
I read about your walk because it was so interesting. You mentioned several walks in your life, but how in your neighborhood you went for a walk with your wife, and you realized that both of you had never really been to the end of the road,
yes.
Having lived there for over 30 years. And the same thing happened to you in California. You hadn't been to the end of that road. It's such a significant and wonderful insight into how you feel about life. it's wonderful. A lot of us should think about it.
And that was actually during the pandemic when we couldn't travel and the health club was closed. We needed exercise. So as you say, we just took the walk outside my mother's house. She'd been there 50 years and I'd never walked to the end of the road, 20 minutes away, until the pandemic forced it. And it was my way of saying, the pandemic was when we all had to take a break. We all had to be resting. And in some ways, many of us suddenly uncovered the treasures of our life, which we didn't notice when we're racing from place to place. And for all the horrors of the pandemic, I think living so close to death made many of us think, how do we really want to live? And what are the things we've been neglecting in our hurry that now we try to incorporate into our lives? I think once the pandemic eased, we forgot all those good resolutions. But at least for a while, we had them.
You didn't forget the view that met you when you went to the end of the road in your mother's home.
No,
and
I
you'd
didn't.
seen it for the first time, the Pacific Ocean and the light above it.
Yes.
It was a beautiful paragraph. So one final question. You write at the end of the year, you're asked to mention the disappointment of the year
Yes.
and the great discovery of the year.
Yes.
So what has been your discovery and your disappointment of 2024?
Now, I can't actually tell you because this is for something for the Financial Times, and I'm sending it into next week, and they'll be disappointed if I. But so I'll
Tell us about last year. Last year.
I'll tell you. Well, I'll tell you the disappointments and discoveries I'm not going to write about for the Financial Times. So
fair enough.
Great
Okay.
discovery. I mean, this sounds like an infomercial. I've been really enjoying the Trident Hotel next door. And just the mushroom risotto at 3 in the morning, I was enjoying. And my disappointment, the greatest disappointment, was being in a car. Whether it's in Mumbai or Los Angeles or so many cities in the world, I think they've even found, scientists, that the greatest frustration in most people's lives is commuting. And hour after hour stuck in a traffic jam when you can't really do anything. And a car is keeping us away from humanity and reality and the jostle of other people. So I'm very happy when I'm in a city with public transportation. I'm very sad when I'm on the freeways of Los Angeles. By the way, you put so much time and thought into all these notes and these questions. I mean, I know, thank you. You've really done a lot of homework.
It was a pleasure, honestly. I just loved it. I could have gone on. And I thought to myself, I need 7 lifetimes to get anywhere close to understanding your work. And I'm just filled with so much admiration. So thank you very much, Pico Iyer, ladies and gentlemen. Yes.
Thank you.
And if we can get the house lights up, and may I remind people who will be asking questions that it has to be a question and not a lecture. And if you exceed your time, you'll either be muted or I will cut you off. You're warned. So there are traveling mics. So can we start? Because we have about 10 minutes. Yeah, thank you.
Hi. Thank you so much for that conversation. That was beautiful. Very quickly, my husband and I adopted a rescue indie a few months ago, and we named her Pico Iyer.
I think I'm honored. I hope I'm honored, yes.
It is an homage to you, but it is because she is filled with curiosity and such an incredible explorer, and she reminds us to be still every day. And I wanted to ask you, what is it that you would like to believe your writing reminds us to do?
Could you ask the last part again?
What do you believe, or what would you like to believe that your writing reminds us to do?
Thank you. And I think I almost said that in my last answer to Shobhaa. I'd like it to give us a chance to stop long enough to remember what we really love. In other words, I find I'm running through my life so much, there are 1,000 things around in my head and in front of me, and most of them are trivial, and some are essential, and I never take the time really to sift the gold from the dross. So if my writing slows you down enough for you to think what really matters in my life and what is essential, that's probably something useful I might be able to do. So the more that the world is moving fast, the more I try to write very, very slowly, to be read very slowly, so as to snap you out of the spell, and suddenly you recall, oh, this is what I care about, which otherwise I've forgotten.
Good evening.
Do you want to identify yourself, please?
My name is Snigdha Hassan. Thank you, Ms. Day, for beautifully describing Mr. Iyer as a philosopher. It gives me the perfect segue to ask him. Sartre had this beautiful term called bad faith, and which basically sums up our reluctance to embrace what we really want to do in life, because we are tied down to various exigencies of life. So what made you pull away from a beautiful life that you were living in the Time magazine, as you mentioned, and embrace that moment, when you were in the layover at Japan and you felt that that's where you belong? What enabled you to switch to that life?
Thank you. Really essential question, and the simple answer would be intuition, or something wiser than me that was inside myself. And it goes back to what Shobhaa was saying about thinking, and like many people in this audience, I went through all these schools that stressed exams and a certain kind of cerebration, and it took me a long time to realize that the best part of me lay somewhere else, in my subconscious, in my imagination, in my heart, and not in my head. And so there was no good reason, as you say, for me to leave this dream job and suddenly do something crazy and move to a temple in Japan. But I remember that when I was young, I read the book Walden by Henry David Thoreau, and he said he didn't want to die feeling he'd never lived. And I realized then, because I was in my 20s, I had no dependents, no responsibilities, relatively easy to take that plunge. And if I'd gone to Japan for a year and had a miserable year, I could probably still come back and start practicing journalism again in New York City, so not so much would be lost, but I had to put it to the test. And it was something, as I say, deeper than knowledge. The last book I brought out was called The Half-Known Life, and it was basically, the longer I've lived, the more I've seen that everything important is what we can't understand and can't control and can't explain. So when I was a kid, I was probably know-it-all. I thought I'm on top of everything. And now I feel I'm on the bottom of the world, being instructed by circumstance. I don't know a thing, and I'm delighted about that. And so whether it's falling in love, or suddenly having an epiphany, or stepping outside the Patala Palace in Lhasa and feeling transformed, or suddenly arriving in an airport town in Japan and feeling this is my secret home, those are the impulses I trust, much more than the ones that I might rationally work out when I'm creating a list of pros and a list of cons. So I'm glad for once in my life, at that time, I was wise enough to realize I have to listen to some voice in my head instead of all the notes I'm keeping.
But I have to say that those of us who used to read Time magazine, subscribed to it back then, was for Lance Morrow and you. Lance Morrow and you were our reasons for reading Time. The rest of it was propaganda.
Well, thank you very much. And it was partly because they were wise enough to say, actually, you may be able to write something in a monastery that wouldn't otherwise appear in our magazine. And so just on my way to this event, somebody was remembering a piece I did for Time 36 years ago on the humble comma. So I wrote a whole essay on the comma. Yes, you remember it. Course, and it was such an unlikely topic for a news magazine. Yeah. But they were generous enough to think maybe a comma will open a greater door than the events of the week just past.
We have 5 more minutes, and we have questions. There's one at the back there. I'm sorry, I can't see. The lights are too strong. Can the volunteers please take...
So maybe we can take this question and then the gentleman at the back, shall we? Oh, gosh, they're all over.
Hi. Hi, Pico.
Hi, everyone's waving.
Yeah. So I have a question for you. If you weren't a writer, say in a parallel world, what profession would you be?
Thank
and why?
you. Maybe I'd be an actor, because I think it's a variation on the same thing, which is trying to get deep into another character so as to uncover something that's locked in yourself. In other words, when Robert De Niro is acting a gangster, say, he's not a gangster himself, but he's tapping something that might not come out in his day-to-day life that's very real. And it's a real journey into another life and another self that otherwise might lie unexcavated. And I think that's what many of us writers try to do when we read, but even more when we write. I mean, you were an actress, weren't you, among other things?
God model, forbid, certainly. No. I spared everyone from watching me on screen. No, never. No.
Almost.
But talking about, there's a quote of yours in the same context of acting. I think it was from Video Night, where you said pop culture, music and dancing have such a profound, far bigger impact on people than bombs. So can you just share that a little with us?
Yes, well, in the 1980s, when finally the Berlin Wall came down and the Cold War was over, I think everybody felt it wasn't that the United States was more politically or militarily strong than the Soviet Union. It was the power of the American dream and American pop culture. It was Michael Jackson and Madonna who achieved in those days much more than perhaps Ronald Reagan. So I think that may have changed subsequently, but you're right, in those days certainly there was a feeling, and also that culture cuts through the divisions that politics and sometimes economics makes. In those days, for example, I wrote a whole book about Islam and America. Yes. And in those days, when I wrote it at the end of the last century, radical Islam was the big official enemy of the United States. At the same time as the single most popular writer in America in those days, and still, was Rumi, the great Islamic mystic. And if you go to Iran, as I did, they know more about American culture than people in California do. So I see culture as a bridge, even as politics is often a wall of some kind.
Hello.
Question at the back.
Konnichiwa.
Konnichiwa. Hi.
Welcome to Mumbai. I think you led me right into my question. You've traveled a lot. You were born to parents, both comparative religion professors,
yes.
No less. So from your travels, what message might you want to share with our city, our country in these fractious times?
So during the pandemic, every day when I woke up, I thought, I have a choice. I can attend to what cuts me up, or I can attend to what opens me up. In other words, I can turn on the news, and I can quickly feel depressed and powerless and hopeless in the face of all these huge events. Or I can take the walk that Shobhaa was asking me about, listen to the music all around me, see the vista of the Pacific, be reminded of all the beauty and wonder around me. And I was thinking, which is going to be most useful to the people I meet this day, and which is going to be most useful to me and my aging mother? Probably opening myself up to what is uplifting and affirming, rather than to the constant, static that we're getting through news reports. So that would be part of it. And the second part would be that each of us, in terms of our ideas and assumptions, is separate from probably most of the people in this room. But in terms of our humanity, we have a lot in common. So again, which are we going to stress? When I get to see Shobhaa for the first time after 28 years, am I going to emphasize the many differences between us, or am I going to draw upon the great similarities? And as you say, in a world that's ever more divided, I think each of us has a chance to make that choice. Since the US election last week, many of my friends in the United States were asking me about what to do in the face of what for them was disappointing or surprising result. And I was reminding them that most of the people who voted differently probably were concerned about their kids, were worried about the economy, were frightened by the pandemic, had so much in common with them. So were they going to stress that, or were they going to stress the ideological differences they had?
Lovely, very nice. Thank you, that's great. One more question,
Yes,
and we are done.
I
And
have the
we
mic.
have a minute and a half.
May I please ask this question? My name is Dr. Kamlesh Desai, and thank you, Pico. You're outstanding. You're a genius. Two things come to my mind. One is the book by Robert Ludlum, and your takeaway on that last point in the Matteries Circle. And I still remember it. I read it when I was 16 years old. Was I Am the Whore of Villa Matteries. And I remember how beautifully the book comes back to me. So thank you for that. But more importantly, I wanted to ask you, there is in my personal view, a philosopher, writer, thinker, genius, who hasn't actually been tapped upon in lit fests, and she was Ayn Rand. What is your view on her philosophy and her amazing thought that still creates so many divisions among people and has so many schools of interpretive thought?
Well, thank you so much for the question. I wish I knew more about her writing. I don't feel I'm qualified to talk about it because I haven't spent enough time studying or reading it.
Then perhaps maybe I might humbly suggest you do. But
yes,
anyway,
thank you
for everything.
No, I'm always grateful for suggestions. Thank you.
Virtues of selfishness. With that, and I'm so sorry, we have to we have to end this. I'm sure we could have carried on for the next half an hour at least, but we do have a session right now. So thank you very much, all of you. It's been fantastic, and thank you.
Thank you.